In a remote corner of the galaxy, far from the bustling trade routes and the bright stars of the central systems, there lay a small, isolated planet. Its surface was rough and uneven, with jagged mountains, deep valleys, and vast stretches of uninhabitable wasteland. The planet had been home to a hardy people for generations, a population that had adapted to the harsh environment and learned to survive where others would have long perished. Life on the planet was never easy, and yet its people had grown strong and resourceful because of it. They built sturdy homes from the materials that were available, learned to farm in rocky soil, and hunted the strange, resilient creatures that roamed their lands. Survival here demanded courage, intelligence, and a deep sense of community, and the people of this world possessed all three. Despite the planet's isolation, the inhabitants were not completely cut off from the wider galaxy. They had access to a few long-range communication networks and occasional travelers who passed by in starships. These connections were scarce and precious, but they provided glimpses of life beyond their own world. The people often listened to stories of distant planets, thriving cities, and powerful civilizations. These tales fascinated them, but they also served as a reminder of how fragile their own world could be in the vastness of space. They had no mighty fleets, no vast armies, and no advanced interstellar technologies like those found in the core sectors of the galaxy. What they had was resilience, determination, and the will to survive. Life on the planet followed a predictable rhythm. The people worked tirelessly during the daylight hours, tending to crops, repairing homes, maintaining equipment, and exploring nearby regions for resources. Evenings were quieter, filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and storytelling. Around small fires or in community halls, elders shared their knowledge of the land, the creatures, and the skies above. Children listened intently, absorbing every detail about surviving in a world where danger lurked in almost every corner. They learned to recognize the signs of storms, the tracks of wild predators, and the subtle changes in the terrain that could signal potential hazards. Over time, the people of the planet had developed a deep connection to their environment, understanding its moods and rhythms in a way that outsiders could hardly imagine. Despite their closeness to nature and each other, there was always an undercurrent of caution among the people. The galaxy beyond their skies was vast and unpredictable, full of both wonders and dangers. Occasionally, scouts would return from the edges of their territory with stories of unusual ships, strange signals, or fleeting glimpses of alien fleets passing through nearby sectors. These encounters were rare, but they reminded the inhabitants that their safety was never guaranteed. Over time, they had grown vigilant, always ready to respond to threats and protect their fragile communities. The society itself was structured around cooperation and mutual support. Families lived in clusters, with multiple generations sharing resources, knowledge, and responsibilities. Leaders were chosen not for their power but for their wisdom, fairness, and ability to make tough decisions in critical moments. Conflicts were resolved through discussion and negotiation, and the concept of unity was central to their survival. Every individual had a role to play, whether it was defending the territory, tending to crops, teaching the young, or maintaining the communication systems that connected them to the wider galaxy. The people understood that their strength lay not in individual heroism, but in collective effort, and this principle had allowed them to endure centuries of harsh conditions. In recent times, however, subtle changes began to unsettle the balance of life on the planet. Sensors and long-range detectors, primitive but effective, began picking up faint signals from distant regions of space. At first, these signals were dismissed as cosmic noise or passing ships, but over months, patterns emerged. The readings suggested the presence of a fleet moving steadily toward their sector. The signals were unlike anything the inhabitants had encountered before, precise, coordinated, and unmistakably artificial. Whispers of worry began circulating among the people. Some argued that it was a natural phenomenon, nothing more than distant energy pulses, while others feared it might be a sign of something far more dangerous. The elders called meetings to discuss the potential threat. In the dim light of community halls, leaders and advisors debated the possibilities. They reviewed their limited knowledge of interstellar technology, analyzed the trajectory of the signals, and speculated on the intentions of the unknown fleet. Opinions were divided. Some believed it was merely a passing group of explorers, curious about their world but harmless. Others insisted on preparing for the worst, convinced that the galaxy was too unpredictable to assume goodwill. Even among the most cautious, a sense of unease began to settle like a shadow over daily life. People started noticing small anomalies in the sky's lights that moved deliberately to be natural, shifts in radiation patterns, and sudden static in long-range communications. Each day brought a new observation, feeding the growing anxiety that their world might soon face a threat unlike any they had ever known. Amidst this tension, life on the planet continued. Farmers still tended their crops, hunters still tracked wildlife, and children still learned about the land. But there was a difference now, a subtle alertness, a wariness in the way people spoke, moved, and observed the skies. Every distant flicker of light, every unusual signal, was scrutinized and discussed. The people began making preparations, reinforcing homes, storing food, and refining defense strategies. There were no massive armadas to call upon, only the ingenuity and resilience of the inhabitants themselves. Yet even these small preparations provided some comfort, a sense of agency in the face of uncertainty. Among the population, there were individuals who specialized in monitoring space, analyzing signals, and interpreting data. These observers worked tirelessly, scanning the heavens for any indication of the approaching fleet. They cross-referenced readings, debated anomalies, and maintained a constant vigil. Nights were spent awake, eyes glued to screens and instruments, trying to make sense of patterns that seemed almost beyond comprehension. Despite their best efforts, the true nature and scale of the fleet remained a mystery. Anxiety grew not only because of what they did not know, but also because of what they feared might arrive. Stories of past encounters and near misses were recounted more frequently. Tales of small skirmishes, rogue fleets, and encounters with hostile civilizations became lessons for the present. Every narrative emphasized the unpredictability of the galaxy and the thin line between survival and annihilation. The inhabitants were reminded that vigilance, intelligence, and cooperation were not optional, they were essential. These stories, while sometimes frightening, also reinforced the community's resilience. They inspired confidence that, if they acted wisely, they could endure challenges that seemed impossible. The psychological impact of the approaching fleet was significant. Families huddled together during storms, children slept with one eye open, and leaders struggled to maintain morale. Yet, despite fear and uncertainty, the inhabitants of the planet refused to succumb to despair. They continued their routines, carried out their responsibilities, and sought comfort in their traditions and in one another. Daily life became a delicate balance between preparation for the unknown and preservation of normalcy. Meals were shared, chores were completed, and stories were told, all while the shadow of a potential threat loomed ever larger. In this way, the stage was set. The inhabitants of the planet were strong, resourceful, and united, yet untested by the scale of the challenge that was fast approaching. They had survived harsh conditions, internal disputes, and occasional threats from wandering fleets, but nothing compared to the mysterious signals that now pierced the calm of their skies. These signals were a call to attention, a reminder that the galaxy was alive with both danger and opportunity. The people knew that whatever arrived would test not only their survival skills but also their courage, their unity, and their ability to face the unknown together. The inhabitants were fully aware that their lives were about to change. The signals from distant space hinted at forces far beyond anything they had faced before. Yet, amid the fear, there was also hope, a hope grounded in centuries of resilience, a trust in one another, and the quiet determination to endure whatever might come. The planet, though small and isolated, had weathered many storms, and its people had proven time and again that they could adapt, survive, and overcome. Now, standing on the edge of a potential crisis, they were ready, in their own way, to confront the unknown, knowing that the story of their world was about to enter a new and uncertain chapter. Life on the planet had continued in its usual rhythm for generations, but the subtle warnings of distant signals began to ripple through the population like a quiet, persistent tremor. At first, many ignored the strange readings, dismissing them as anomalies or errors in the old detection systems. The planet's people had always experienced oddities in the skies, flashes of light, strange energy patterns, and fleeting streaks that moved too fast to understand. Most of these events were harmless and faded as quickly as they appeared. But as months passed, the pattern of the incoming signals became undeniable. They were regular, structured, and consistent. They were not natural phenomena, and they were not random. Something, or someone, was approaching. The first signs of alarm spread slowly through the communities. Scouts and observers returned from their patrols with reports of distant fleets, faint but distinct. The readings suggested enormous ships, moving in formation, heading straight toward their sector. Some tried to reassure their neighbors, suggesting the fleet was simply passing through, perhaps on a diplomatic or exploratory mission. Others, however, could not shake the unease that settled deep in their minds. The signals were too precise, too coordinated, and far too organized to be anything simple. Whispers of fear began circulating, first in the markets and workshops, then in homes and community centers. People wondered whether the isolation that had kept them safe for centuries might finally be broken. As the days turned into weeks, the tension became more palpable. Families who had once gone about their routines without thought now paused to scan the skies. Farmers worked in silence, glancing upward for signs of movement beyond the clouds of their atmosphere. Hunters returned earlier than usual, uneasy with the thought of being far from the safety of the community. Children sensed the change in mood and asked endless questions, which parents struggled to answer. The elders spoke cautiously, balancing honesty with reassurance, telling stories of resilience and survival while trying not to instill panic. Yet, no matter how carefully words were chosen, the fear was unavoidable. The planet's leaders convened urgent meetings, gathering their most experienced advisors, scouts, and strategists. The council debated the nature of the approaching fleet, examining every piece of evidence they had. Some insisted on remaining calm, emphasizing that panic could be as dangerous as any enemy. They suggested observing the fleet's approach carefully, trying to understand their intentions before making hasty decisions. Others argued that caution alone was insufficient. They advocated for preparations, strengthening defenses, stockpiling resources, and readying the population for the possibility of conflict. These discussions were heated, with voices raised and tempers flaring. Each participant was aware that the choices they made could determine the survival of their people. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens began to notice changes in the way their community functioned. Markets and trade routes, normally bustling and lively, became quieter as people focused on preparations. Workshops shifted from crafting routine tools to reinforcing homes and public structures. Engineers and builders worked day and night, fortifying walls, creating defensive positions, and ensuring that every shelter could withstand unexpected challenges. Farmers planted faster-growing crops to secure food for uncertain times. Hunters extended their patrols to detect approaching threats before they could reach populated areas. Even children were taught how to help, whether by carrying supplies, delivering messages, or observing the skies for unusual activity. The planet became a hive of activity, every individual contributing to the collective readiness of the community. Amid these preparations, communication became critical. The planet's observers monitored long-range signals, trying to decode patterns and anticipate the fleet's arrival. Teams of analysts pored over every detail, from the faintest blip on a scanner to the subtle shifts in energy waves. They debated endlessly, considering various possibilities. Was the fleet hostile, neutral, or perhaps even friendly? Each scenario had consequences, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on their minds. Night after night, these observers worked tirelessly, sacrificing sleep and comfort to ensure that their people would not be caught unprepared. They developed strategies for rapid evacuation, defensive positioning, and coordinated responses, knowing that even the smallest miscalculation could prove disastrous. Tensions were not limited to strategy and preparation. Human emotions played a significant role as fear and uncertainty seeped into every corner of life. Families argued over what actions to take, while some neighbors accused others of overreacting. Doubts and mistrust began to creep in. Could their leaders be trusted to make the right decisions? Were scouts and observers truly capable of interpreting the signals correctly? These questions created friction, but they also forced the community to confront its weaknesses. In the face of fear, people were learning the importance of trust, communication, and collective action. As the fleet drew closer, the first visible signs of its approach appeared in the skies. Faint glimmers of light, initially mistaken for stars, slowly shifted and moved with deliberate precision. Soon, the shapes of massive ships became discernible through long-range sensors and the naked eye. Even the most skeptical among the population could no longer deny the reality. Something extraordinary and potentially dangerous was coming. The sheer scale of the fleet was staggering. Thousands of ships, each larger and more formidable than anything the planet had ever seen, moved in formation, maintaining exact distances from one another. The spectacle was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a reminder of the vastness and power of the galaxy beyond their isolated home. Fear mingled with curiosity as people gathered in open areas, observing the distant fleet. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed at the sight of enormous vessels silhouetted against the backdrop of stars. Elders spoke in hushed tones, recalling legends of distant civilizations and their encounters with powerful fleets. Scholars and strategists debated the fleet's possible intentions, weighing every known fact against countless unknowns. Some argued that the fleet's precision indicated advanced intelligence and discipline, suggesting they could be merciful or strategic rather than purely destructive. Others feared that such strength could only mean domination and conquest. The planet collectively held its breath, aware that the next days could determine the future of their world. In response to the looming threat, the leaders made a difficult decision. They would send a distress signaler call for help to any allies or neutral parties in nearby sectors. The decision was not taken lightly. The people knew that calling for assistance might reveal their vulnerability, but it was a necessary risk. Resources were scarce, and their defenses, while strong for their size, could not withstand a prolonged assault from such an imposing fleet. The distress signal was crafted carefully, detailing the potential threat, the planet's capabilities, and the urgent need for assistance. The message was broadcast across multiple channels, hoping that someone, somewhere, would receive it and respond before it was too late. While waiting for a response, the planet's population intensified their preparations. Training exercises were conducted, and emergency plans were reviewed and updated. Families were organized into support units, with clear roles for defense, evacuation, and resource management. Every individual understood the importance of discipline and readiness. Fear remained, but it was tempered by purpose. People realized that panic could be as deadly as any fleet, and that survival required focus, cooperation, and careful planning. The approaching fleet had another effect. It forced the inhabitants to confront their own limitations. They were reminded of the fragility of their existence in the galaxy and the importance of innovation, adaptability, and courage. The planet's young engineers worked tirelessly to improve sensor systems, repair old defensive equipment, and even experiment with new technologies. Scouts ventured further into unexplored regions to gather intelligence, often facing harsh conditions and dangerous terrain. Communities shared resources freely, knowing that selfishness could jeopardize the survival of everyone. Over time, fear transformed into a cautious determination, a recognition that while the threat was immense, so too was the potential for resilience and heroism. As days passed, the atmosphere grew tense but purposeful. Children adapted to the new routines, learning basic survival skills and emergency procedures. Adults balanced their daily responsibilities with the urgent preparations demanded by the approaching fleet. Elders offered guidance and reassurance, drawing on centuries of experience to maintain morale. Even pets and livestock were integrated into the planning, moved to safer locations, or trained to respond to emergency situations. The planet became a model of organized readiness, each individual contributing to a collective effort that transcended fear and uncertainty. The first visible skirmishes on the fringes of their sector were minor, yet they served as a warning. A few scouting ships from the approaching fleet tested the planet's defenses, probing and observing. The inhabitants responded cautiously, analyzing the fleet's behavior without engaging unnecessarily. These early encounters offered valuable lessons, revealing both strengths and weaknesses in their strategy. Adjustments were made, drills were refined, and the population learned to act with precision and unity under pressure. These early skirmishes, while small, marked a turning point in the way the people of the planet viewed the situation. It was no longer abstract. The threat was real, and preparation was the key to survival. The people of the planet had changed. They were no longer simply survivors of a harsh environment. They were a society tested under the looming shadow of a formidable external threat. Every individual, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, had a role in the unfolding conflict. They had learned to act with precision, to trust one another, and to respond to danger with courage and intelligence. The rising conflict had revealed vulnerabilities, but it had also revealed extraordinary strength, resourcefulness, and unity. The inhabitants now stood ready for whatever came next, aware that the approaching fleet could challenge them in ways they had never imagined, but confident that together, they could face it. The rising conflict had intensified fear, tested resolve, and revealed the true scale of the approaching fleet. The people had adapted, learned, and prepared, yet they knew the most critical moments were still ahead. The battle for survival was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. Every strategy, every drill, every ounce of courage would soon be put to the ultimate test. The inhabitants understood that the choices they made in the coming days could determine the fate of their world, and they were determined to face the challenge with unity, intelligence, and unwavering determination. The day the fleet arrived fully in their sector was the day the people of the planet realized the reality of the threat they had been preparing for. The distant signals that had once seemed like a vague warning now transformed into an overwhelming presence in the sky. Thousands of massive ships filled the horizon, stretching farther than anyone could see, moving in perfect formations that spoke of precision, discipline, and immense power. The sight was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. For the first time, the inhabitants could no longer rely on imagination or speculation. They were witnessing the fleet with their own eyes. The scale of it was beyond comprehension, and fear rippled through the population like a physical force, touching every home, every family, every individual. Panic spread quickly, as though the very sight of the fleet had ignited an instinctual terror in every person. Streets emptied as families rushed to safe zones and fortified shelters, abandoning daily routines and taking shelter wherever they could find protection. The cries of children echoed through homes as parents attempted to calm them, even while their own hearts pounded with worry. Community leaders and elders worked frantically to organize civilians, giving instructions for evacuation, distribution of supplies, and defensive positioning. Communication networks buzzed constantly with messages, updates, and warnings, and every alert was met with intense activity and anxiety. The planet had been preparing for this moment, but the reality of facing the fleet in full force tested their nerves and resolve like never before. The first confrontations began almost immediately. Small groups of the fleet's ships descended closer to the planet, scanning, probing, and testing the defenses that had been prepared for weeks. The inhabitants responded quickly, utilizing every sensor, turret, and defensive mechanism at their disposal. The exchanges were brief but intense, flashes of energy and bursts of fire lighting up the skies above. While the inhabitants managed to repel the first probes, the effort revealed vulnerabilities they had not anticipated. Defensive structures that seemed strong in simulations faltered under the advanced technology of the fleet, forcing engineers and strategists to adapt rapidly in real time. The realization was chilling. The fleet was not only vast and powerful but intelligent and highly capable of assessing and exploiting weaknesses. Inside the command centers, leaders faced an unprecedented level of stress. They had spent months planning, analyzing, and preparing, but nothing could fully convey the experience of seeing the fleet's size, coordination, and efficiency firsthand. Decisions that had once seemed simple now carried extraordinary weight. Every command, every allocation of resources, and every choice about where to deploy personnel could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Arguments flared among strategists as they debated whether to engage, retreat, or attempt negotiation. The pressure was immense, and even those who had been calm and confident for months now felt the weight of fear pressing down. Yet, amid the tension, they understood that hesitation could be fatal. Action, precision, and unity were their only chances to survive. The civilians on the ground were experiencing the breaking point in their own ways. Families huddled together in reinforced shelters, listening to the distant hum and roar of the fleet above. The atmosphere was thick with fear, tension, and anticipation. Children clutched their parents' hands, while adults struggled to suppress panic for the sake of those who depended on them. Communities moved as one, following evacuation routes, transporting supplies, and assisting those who were unable to move quickly on their own. The people had trained for emergencies, drilled for attacks, and prepared for the unknown. But nothing could fully prepare them for the sheer magnitude of this moment. The breaking point was not just a test of technology or strategy, it was a test of the human spirit as the fleet's presence grew more intense. The first direct assaults occurred. Massive ships descended toward key population centers, and the inhabitants were forced into full-scale defensive action. Energy weapons lit up the skies, shields flared under immense pressure, and explosions shook the ground as defensive turrets and small spacecraft engaged the fleet's vessels. The inhabitants fought with every resource and tactic available. Yet it became painfully clear that the fleet's superiority was overwhelming. Losses were inevitable, and every action seemed to stretch the limits of their endurance. The population had reached the brink, forced to confront not only the external threat but also the fear, fatigue, and uncertainty within themselves. Amid the chaos, extraordinary acts of bravery emerged. Citizens who had never seen battle took up positions to defend their homes and neighbors, navigating through dangerous zones with courage that surpassed expectation. Engineers and scientists improvised new defensive mechanisms in real time, adapting old technologies to counter the fleet's advanced systems. Scouts and messengers braved open spaces under fire to ensure communication remained intact. Each act, no matter how small, contributed to the larger effort, reminding the inhabitants that survival depended not only on strategy but also on courage, ingenuity, and collaboration. The psychological strain on the population was immense. Sleepless nights became the norm, as people took shifts maintaining surveillance, operating defensive systems, and assisting the injured. Children who had previously been sheltered were now witnessing the harsh realities of conflict, forcing adults to balance honesty with reassurance. Families relied on each other in unprecedented ways, forming support networks that extended beyond immediate relatives to neighbors and strangers. Fear coexisted with determination, anxiety with resilience, and despair with hope. Every individual was aware that the coming hours could decide the fate of not just their own lives but the survival of the entire planet. Strategically, the breaking point revealed a need for complete adaptation. The inhabitants had planned for many scenarios, but the fleet's capabilities exceeded all expectations. Defensive positions were rapidly reassessed, evacuation routes altered, and communication lines prioritized for maximum efficiency. The leaders understood that they could not rely solely on conventional strategies. They needed to innovate on the spot, anticipate the fleet's moves, and exploit any potential weakness they could identify. The population as a whole was forced into a state of hyper-awareness where every decision, action, and observation could influence the outcome of the conflict. Amid the fear and chaos, the first glimmers of hope began to emerge. Observers noticed subtle patterns in the fleet's movements, suggesting that they were not acting purely aggressively. Small anomalies in their coordination indicated possible hesitation or caution, offering a chance to exploit these openings. Strategists quickly seized upon these observations, adjusting tactics and focusing defensive efforts where the fleet's pattern seemed less synchronized. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, careful observation, intelligence, and quick adaptation could provide critical advantages. The breaking point, though terrifying, also became a crucible in which the inhabitants' courage and resourcefulness were tested and strengthened. The population faced moral dilemmas alongside strategic ones. Decisions had to be made about which areas to defend most vigorously, which individuals could be spared, and how to prioritize resources when every choice had life or death consequences. The weight of responsibility was immense. Leaders wrestled with guilt and doubt, questioning whether their decisions were just, necessary, or sufficient. Citizens, too, were forced to make difficult choices, from risking their own lives to protect neighbors to deciding how best to contribute to the collective defense. Every action carried consequences, reinforcing the gravity of the moment. As the first full day of engagement passed, it became evident that the breaking point was not a single instant but a prolonged period of extreme pressure. The fleet maintained relentless pressure on multiple fronts, testing defensive structures, probing for weaknesses, and exploiting any gaps that appeared. The inhabitants responded with every tactic and strategy they could muster, learning and adapting with each encounter. The population became a living network of observation, communication, and action, each individual contributing to the larger effort. It was a moment in which fear, courage, and ingenuity collided, creating a tense but purposeful rhythm of survival. Amid this tension, extraordinary leadership emerged. Individuals who had been advisors or observers assumed decisive roles, making split-second judgments that saved lives and preserved defensive positions. Leaders who had previously been cautious demonstrated boldness, coordinating strikes and reinforcing critical areas. Communication and trust became essential, as every signal, message, and observation had to be accurate and timely. The population learned quickly that unity, coordination, and confidence in each other's abilities were as vital as any technology or weaponry. Even with moments of hope, the fear of overwhelming loss never disappeared. The fleet's sheer scale meant that no matter how well the inhabitants adapted, there were limits to what they could defend. Civilians watched as small skirmishes escalated into larger confrontations, explosions shaking the ground, and fires consuming parts of their environment. Each encounter was a reminder of the stakes involved, a stark illustration of the fragility of life when facing such formidable power. Yet, through every challenge, the population remained resolute. Fear was acknowledged but not allowed to dominate. Despair existed but did not paralyze out by the end of this critical period. The breaking point had transformed the inhabitants in fundamental ways. They were no longer simply survivors preparing for a threat. They were active participants in a high-stakes struggle for survival. Every individual had faced the limits of endurance, courage, and ingenuity. Families had been tested, leaders had been tested, and the population as a whole had been tested. Yet in the midst of chaos, the people had discovered their capacity for resilience, resourcefulness, and unity. The breaking point had pushed them to the edge, revealing both the magnitude of the challenge and the extraordinary strength that lay within them. The fleet's presence had brought the population to its most critical point, forcing confrontation, adaptation, and the demonstration of courage on every level. The inhabitants had survived the first shock, adapted to the pressure, and discovered new reserves of strength within themselves. The breaking point was both a test and a transformation, showing that while the fleet's power was immense, the determination, ingenuity, and unity of the planet's people could not be underestimated. The next steps, whether survival, resistance, or unexpected assistance, would build on the lessons learned during this most intense and defining period. After days of constant tension, fear, and fierce defensive actions, the people of the planet began to notice subtle shifts in the behavior of the approaching fleet. The immense forces that had seemed unstoppable during the initial arrival now appeared more measured, less aggressive, and strangely focused. While their ships remained vast, their formations precise, and their technology overwhelming, the inhabitants detected signs that the fleet was responding to their own signals, patterns, and defensive measures in ways that suggested observation rather than outright hostility. Analysts pored over these details tirelessly, comparing movement patterns, energy readings, and engagement behaviors. Slowly, a realization began to spread through the leadership and strategists alike. The fleet was not here to destroy them indiscriminately. This revelation brought a cautious sense of relief to the population, but it did not eliminate the need for vigilance. While fear began to ease slightly, the inhabitants understood that the fleet's intentions were still unknown and that a single misstep could trigger disaster. Leaders worked tirelessly to interpret every signal, every action, and every change in the fleet's approach. The community as a whole remained on high alert, balancing hope with preparation. Citizens continued to man defensive positions, monitor the skies, and maintain communication networks. The shift in the fleet's behavior, while encouraging, required the people to remain focused, disciplined, and ready to act at a moment's notice. As the inhabitants observed the fleet more closely, patterns emerged that suggested coordination and purpose. Rather than launching attacks on critical infrastructure, the fleet focused on scanning, observation, and subtle maneuvers. This cautious behavior was interpreted as an indication that the fleet was willing to work with the planet's people, rather than simply imposing dominance or destruction. Leaders recognized that they now had a unique opportunity to communicate, coordinate, and cooperate with an advanced civilization that had arrived in response to their distress signals. This realization shifted the mood across the planet, replacing some of the terror with a mixture of hope and anticipation. Communication became the central focus of the inhabitants' efforts. Using long-range transmitters and coded messages, they attempted to establish dialogue with the fleet, sending signals of cooperation, understanding, and readiness to coordinate defensive measures. The inhabitants were careful in their messaging, mindful that any mistake could be misinterpreted and provoke hostility. Analysts worked in shifts, monitoring responses and refining communications. While the population remained engaged in defense and observation, every individual, from the youngest scout to the most experienced engineer, understood that their combined effort could influence the outcome. The stakes were immense, but so too was the potential for survival through intelligent coordination. Gradually, direct interactions between the planet's defenders and the fleet began to take place. Small reconnaissance ships moved cautiously closer, allowing the inhabitants to observe the advanced capabilities of the fleet up close. The technological superiority of the visitors was undeniable. Their ships were fast, powerful, and precisely controlled, with defensive systems far beyond anything the planet could have imagined. Yet, despite this overwhelming advantage, the fleet did not attack the population indiscriminately. Instead, they appeared to act as guardians, positioning themselves strategically to deter external threats and protect the planet's critical areas. The inhabitants realized that the fleet's arrival, while initially terrifying, that had brought an unprecedented opportunity to work with an ally of immense power. The inhabitants, now fully aware of the fleet's intentions, began to adjust their strategies. Defensive positions were optimized not just to resist attacks but to complement the presence of the fleet. Evacuation plans were modified to integrate coordination with the visitors, ensuring that the population could be protected while critical infrastructure and resources remained intact. Communication protocols were refined to maintain constant contact with the fleet, and observers worked tirelessly to ensure that no movement or signal went unnoticed. The inhabitants had shifted from a purely defensive posture to a coordinated, collaborative strategy, where human ingenuity and the fleet's superior technology could work together to neutralize threats. This coordinated effort proved critical when external dangers emerged. Rogue vessels, previously unseen in the sector, attempted to exploit perceived weaknesses, moving toward the planet in what appeared to be opportunistic attacks. The combined forces of the inhabitants and the fleet responded swiftly. Defensive turrets and ships operated in concert with the fleet's powerful vessels, creating a synchronized response that overwhelmed the attackers. Energy blasts, shields, and maneuvering patterns worked seamlessly between the two forces, demonstrating that cooperation, intelligence, and courage could amplify the effectiveness of even the smaller, less advanced population. Citizens watched in awe as their defenses, once limited and fragile, were now reinforced by unmatched power and precision. Amid these engagements, the inhabitants gained not only safety but also confidence. They had seen firsthand that careful observation, strategic planning, and decisive action could mitigate threats that had once seemed insurmountable. Engineers and strategists learned from the fleet's technology, adapting methods and concepts that could be applied to their own defensive systems. Scouts and observers discovered new approaches to monitoring and predicting enemy movements, guided by the behavior of the advanced visitors. Even ordinary citizens, through their participation in drills, evacuations, and support roles, developed a deeper understanding of tactics, coordination, and the importance of community in moments of crisis. Throughout this period, morale on the planet gradually shifted. The initial terror of the fleet's arrival transformed into respect, understanding, and cautious optimism. Communities came together, recognizing that they were no longer facing the galaxy's dangers alone. Children who had once clung to their parents in fear began to observe, ask questions, and even assist in small but meaningful ways. Families shared stories of courage, bravery, and ingenuity that emerged during the crisis, reinforcing a sense of pride and collective accomplishment. The population realized that their resilience, resourcefulness, and willingness to cooperate had earned them the chance to survive and thrive, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. As the days of coordinated action continued, the fleet's presence became more structured and supportive. Their ships provided not only protection but also guidance, demonstrating patterns and techniques that the inhabitants could integrate into their own strategies. Observation posts, defensive networks, and communication hubs were enhanced, combining human ingenuity with technological sophistication. The inhabitants were no longer merely responding to threats, they were actively shaping the defense of their planet alongside the fleet, participating in a collaboration that reinforced both safety and confidence. The resolution of the crisis was further solidified when the external threats, which had been testing the planet's defenses during the fleet's arrival, were neutralized. The rogue vessels were destroyed or forced to retreat, unable to overcome the combined strategy and power of the planet's population and the fleet. Relief spread throughout the communities, as people realized that their world was no longer immediately at risk of destruction. Yet, the resolution was not simply about survival. It was about learning, growth, and the establishment of a cooperative relationship with forces far more advanced than they had ever encountered. Even as external dangers subsided, the inhabitants remained vigilant. The lessons of the conflict had been profound. Preparation, unity, intelligence, and courage were as important as any technology or weaponry. Citizens continued to maintain defenses, monitor communications, and participate in coordinated exercises, understanding that the galaxy remained unpredictable. The experience of working with the fleet had expanded their understanding of strategy, technology, and collaboration, providing knowledge and confidence that would serve them in future challenges. The fleet itself began to integrate more fully into the planet's defense efforts, establishing protocols for communication, observation and coordination. Leaders from both sides collaborated on tactical plans, sharing insights and strategies. The inhabitants learned about advanced surveillance techniques, energy management, and predictive modeling, while the fleet gained understanding of the planet's terrain, culture, and unique strengths. This partnership demonstrated that the resolution of the crisis was not merely a result of power, but of cooperation, intelligence, and mutual respect. Throughout the resolution, extraordinary acts of heroism continued to shape the narrative. Engineers who had worked tirelessly to reinforce infrastructure discovered innovative solutions that saved lives. Citizens who had been frightened or hesitant stepped forward in critical moments, assisting in evacuations, communications, or logistical support. Observers and scouts provided information that allowed the combined forces to anticipate and neutralize threats before they could escalate. Every action, every contribution, reinforced the idea that the planet's survival was not dependent solely on the fleet, but on the courage, ingenuity, and determination of its people. The resolution also brought a shift in perspective among the population. Where fear and uncertainty had once dominated, a sense of confidence and empowerment now emerged. The inhabitants had faced an overwhelming threat, adapted in real time, and collaborated successfully with a force of extraordinary capability. They understood that survival had been possible not merely through the fleet's intervention, but through their own resilience, creativity, and willingness to work together under pressure. Stories of the resolution spread quickly, reinforcing lessons about courage, collaboration, and the importance of careful observation and strategic thinking. The planet's society had been transformed. Individuals who had once doubted their own abilities discovered strength, resourcefulness, and courage. Communities that had once been fractured by fear and uncertainty now operated with unity and confidence. Leaders, scientists, engineers, and ordinary citizens alike had learned that collaboration, intelligence, and bravery could overcome even the most intimidating challenges. The resolution of the crisis was more than a temporary reprieve. It was a profound affirmation of the population's capabilities, adaptability, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The inhabitants had survived the immediate threat, established a powerful alliance, and demonstrated extraordinary courage and ingenuity. Yet the lessons learned during the resolution would continue to influence the society for years to come, shaping strategies, strengthening communities, and reinforcing the understanding that preparation, unity, and collaboration were keys not only to survival, but to thriving in a galaxy filled with both wonder and danger. The aftermath of the crisis left the planet in a state of both relief and profound transformation. 4 weeks after the fleet's arrival and the resolution of the immediate threat, the inhabitants were busy tending to the consequences of the conflict, repairing infrastructure, restoring routines, and adjusting to the presence of allies who had come to their aid. The once distant and terrifying fleet was now a visible, almost familiar presence in the skies, a symbol of the support that had saved the planet from destruction. Citizens cautiously ventured back into areas that had been evacuated, inspecting damage, salvaging resources, and helping neighbors recover from the stress and disruptions caused by the threat. The streets, once silent with fear and tension, began to hum with the careful rhythm of daily life returning. Yet even as life resumed, the psychological impact of the events lingered. Individuals carried memories of fear, uncertainty, and the adrenaline-fueled intensity of the days when the fleet had arrived in full force. Parents quietly watched their children, realizing how much they had been exposed to danger and how quickly young minds had absorbed lessons about courage, cooperation, and vigilance. Elder citizens reflected on the generational changes that had occurred, noting how the crisis had brought out both the strengths and vulnerabilities of their society. Every citizen had been touched in some way through direct participation in defense efforts, through the emotional toll of fear, or through witnessing acts of heroism that redefined what it meant to be resilient. The leaders of the planet convened multiple councils to assess the situation in detail. They reviewed what had worked, what had failed, and how the society had adapted under extreme stress. The resolution had not been accidental. It had been the result of careful planning, rapid adaptation, and extraordinary courage by countless individuals. Leaders documented strategies, revised protocols, and developed new plans for defense and coordination, recognizing that the galaxy remained unpredictable and that future threats could arrive without warning. There was an understanding that the lessons learned during the crisis were not temporary. They would shape the society's approach to security, technology, and community for decades to come. Collaboration with the fleet continued even after the immediate threat had passed. Observers, engineers, and leaders engaged in exchanges of knowledge, learning advanced technologies, new strategies, and methods of surveillance and coordination that were previously unimaginable. These exchanges were mutual. The fleet also learned about the planet's unique strengths, terrain, and cultural practices. Citizens who had participated directly in defense operations found themselves in new roles as instructors, analysts, or coordinators, sharing their experiences and insights with others. The crisis had created a bridge between two civilizations, fostering mutual respect, understanding, and collaboration that went far beyond the immediate demands of survival. Communities focused on rebuilding and strengthening resilience. Homes, shelters, and public buildings were repaired, reinforced, and upgraded, incorporating lessons learned during the crisis. The streets and marketplaces reopened with a cautious optimism as people resumed trade, work, and social interactions. At the same time, drills and preparedness exercises became a routine part of life. Children were taught lessons about strategy, observation, and community responsibility alongside traditional education. Citizens of all ages remained engaged in maintaining alertness, knowing that vigilance was key to preventing future crises from escalating. Life was returning to a semblance of normality, but the memory of the breaking point and the lessons learned during the confrontation remained. Ever-present acts of heroism and ingenuity were commemorated widely. Stories of bravery, quick thinking, and collaboration spread through the population, becoming a source of inspiration and pride. Engineers who had invented new defensive mechanisms, scouts who had risked their lives to deliver critical information, and families who had maintained order and support during evacuations were recognized publicly. These stories reinforced the values of courage, adaptability, and collective effort. Citizens understood that survival had not been the result of a single individual's actions, but of a society that had worked in unison under extreme pressure. The recognition of these efforts created a sense of unity and strengthened the bonds between communities. The presence of the fleet introduced new perspectives on technology and strategy. Citizens observed ships, systems, and techniques far beyond their previous understanding, sparking curiosity and innovation. Scientists, engineers, and students studied the fleet's mechanisms, learning principles that could be adapted to local technology. They began developing advanced methods for communication, energy management, and surveillance. Even the children, who would watch the events unfold with awe and fear, were inspired to ask questions, imagine possibilities, and explore concepts that had previously seemed abstract or impossible. The crisis had ignited a renewed passion for learning, experimentation, and advancement across generations. Cultural and social changes became evident as well. The crisis had taught the inhabitants the value of unity, trust, and cooperation. Communities had witnessed firsthand how reliance on one another could mean the difference between life and death. Social norms shifted subtly but profoundly, as collaboration and collective responsibility became central to daily life. Citizens were more aware of their impact on neighbors, more considerate in decision-making, and more prepared to act in support of the community. These changes were reinforced through public discussions, educational programs, and shared storytelling, ensuring that the lessons of courage, cooperation, and resilience would persist long after the immediate threat had passed. Reflection became a key part of life after the crisis. Leaders and citizens alike pondered the enormity of what had occurred: the arrival of a fleet of unimaginable scale, the confrontation with fear and uncertainty, and the triumph of coordinated action. Individuals considered their own roles, assessing moments of courage, hesitation, and ingenuity. Families discussed the lessons learned, both practical and moral, emphasizing the importance of preparation, vigilance, and unity. The society as a whole reflected on how the crisis had reshaped them, strengthening bonds, expanding knowledge, and redefining what it meant to survive and thrive in a vast and unpredictable galaxy. Economic and logistical recovery was a significant component of the aftermath. Resources had been diverted for defense, infrastructure had been damaged, and trade had been disrupted. Citizens and leaders worked together to rebuild, repair, and replenish essential supplies. Markets reopened, supply lines were restored, and workshops resumed production. At the same time, lessons from the crisis influenced long-term planning. Strategic reserves were established, energy systems were reinforced, and communication networks were upgraded to prevent future vulnerabilities. The society had not only survived but also emerged more capable and prepared for challenges yet unseen. The fleet's presence became integrated into the society's sense of security and collaboration. Their ships patrolled strategic areas, offered guidance, and assisted in maintaining peace and stability. The inhabitants learned to interpret subtle signals from the fleet, coordinating movements, sharing information, and anticipating potential threats together. The relationship evolved beyond one of assistance into a true partnership, where the inhabitants contributed knowledge of local conditions and strategic insights, while the fleet provided technological superiority and advanced experience. This alliance symbolized a profound transformation in the planet's perception of the galaxy. They were no longer isolated, vulnerable, or helpless. The emotional and psychological growth of the population was as significant as the practical recovery. Individuals who had faced intense fear discovered courage and resilience within themselves. Families strengthened bonds through shared trials. Communities recognized the power of unity and mutual support. Children grew up with first-hand knowledge of crisis management, cooperation, and the importance of courage under pressure. The crisis had been a crucible, forging stronger, wiser, and more confident citizens, equipped not just to survive, but to thrive and advance in a complex and often dangerous universe. Memories of the breaking point in the intense days of conflict were preserved as stories, lessons, and historical accounts. These narratives served multiple purposes. They honored bravery, transmitted practical knowledge, and reminded future generations of the importance of vigilance, preparation, and collaboration. Schools, community centers, and families shared these experiences, emphasizing both the fear and the triumph, ensuring that the lessons of the crisis would be remembered and applied for generations to come. The inhabitants understood that reflection was essential to growth, and that survival was inseparable from learning and adaptation. In the months and years that followed, the society embraced a new identity shaped by the events they had endured. They were no longer a population defined solely by their isolation. They were a society marked by resilience, ingenuity, and an expanded understanding of the galaxy beyond their world. Their relationship with the fleet symbolized not only protection but also opportunity, a bridge to knowledge, cooperation, and technological advancement. Citizens engaged in scientific research, cultural exchange, and strategic planning with renewed vigor, inspired by the realization that even the most overwhelming challenges could be met with intelligence, courage, and unity. The reflection on the crisis also prompted philosophical and moral contemplation. The inhabitants considered the nature of fear, courage, and responsibility. They understood that survival required not only physical preparation but also emotional strength, cooperation, and ethical decision-making. Stories of sacrifice, ingenuity, and collective action became central to societal identity, shaping values, guiding future decisions, and inspiring continued vigilance. The population learned that the true measure of survival was not only in repelling threats but in maintaining integrity, unity, and humanity in the face of adversity. Ultimately, the aftermath and reflection solidified a society transformed. The planet had faced a threat beyond imagination, confronted fear and uncertainty at its deepest, and emerged not only alive but strengthened in every dimension: technological, social, emotional, and cultural. Citizens understood that the galaxy was vast, unpredictable, and often dangerous, yet they also recognized their own capacity for courage, innovation, and cooperation. The events had tested every aspect of their civilization and revealed extraordinary resilience. They now moved forward with knowledge, confidence, and a sense of unity that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The people of the planet, having survived the fleet's arrival and the subsequent confrontation, had become a model of courage, preparedness, and cooperation. The alliance with the fleet offered a glimpse of what could be achieved through collaboration across civilizations. The lessons learned during the crisis for the importance of vigilance, strategy, adaptability, and moral integrity would remain deeply embedded in the collective consciousness. Through reflection, the society had grown stronger, wiser, and more prepared to face the vast uncertainties of the galaxy. The aftermath was not merely a return to normalcy. It was the birth of a civilization redefined by experience, resilience, and hope.